So let's circle around a little bit and go back to the Christian worldview. Back in, say, the Reformation, 15th century or 14th century or 16th century, I can't
16th
remember how
century,
it
right? Yeah,
works.
yeah, it did worse
Um,
word.
so you had a revamp of studying the scriptures, which is one of those things. The Christian scriptures are one of those things that are a mark in the sand that doesn't move. It's a reference point. And as political thinking developed in Europe and Britain, certain subsets of the Christian worldview came out of that, and I would consider that to be classical liberalism and the idea of conservative politics. Would you agree with that?
Yes, the early humanists were Christian humanists, Erasmus of Rotterdam and others. It wasn't until later, after the experience of the existentialists, beginning with Søren Kierkegaard, tried to prove the existence of God by using reason and logic, not starting with revelation outside the universe and working in, but rather starting from reason and working out. That's what got us into this whole mess several hundred years ago. They switched that. They hijacked Christian humanism and moved it into secular humanism. That's where the change occurred. So what came out of the Protestant Reformation was a switch from the idea that in order to have law, you had to have a king, and that he was ordained by God to do XYZ. And the only way to get to God was the church. So, and of course, to go through the church, you went through your priest, who went through the bishop, who went through the pope, and they dispensed sacraments on down and vice versa. The Reformation said, no, we're all responsible as individuals. You know, Martin Luther wrote on the freedom of the Christian man. We're saved by grace through faith in Christ. We're not dependent upon anybody else to do that. You don't have to have all these sacraments. You don't have to step through all these hoops that had been added over the years. And they had been added. They were not there in the early church. So they went back to the foundation of the scriptures. That created the idea that I'm responsible before God, but I also have a tremendous amount of freedom as well to perform. Like, remember Jesus, the parable of the talents. He gave one guy 1 talent, 5 talents, 10 talents. And the guys with the 5 and the 10, they went out and did some stuff with it. Okay, I'm going to do some stuff. Yeah, there's a risk. It's a little dangerous here. I could lose it, but I'm going to try to make more. Whereas the man with 1, oh boy, I'm just so afraid I could lose this. And he just buried it. I mean, he didn't even put it with the bankers or with an investment broker who could have at least multiplied it, you know. That's where we started into where we are. Also, the idea of the value of individuals came out of the Protestant Reformation, that every individual, born, unborn, of all different ages, of all different groups, had value. Now, it took time to work that out in culture and in law, but we did work it out, and it is unique. There's a terrific book out by a Spanish author, Cesar Vidal, called A Changing World, Patriotism in an Age of Globalism. And he starts with that. The first part of the book, he lays the whole history of Western philosophy in a very readable fashion. It's intriguing when he does it. From the Middle Ages, starting with the reintroduction of the Greek philosophers into the West and into Christian theological thinking, then into the Reformation, and how it set the groundwork for the freedoms we enjoy today. We talk a lot about human rights. Everybody's parading around nowadays by parading human rights. Everybody says, humans have rights. Put up your hand. Who says? Who says so? They will say that, say, for example, colonialism is wrong. This is the big bugaboo as part of that. And I go, well, isn't that how it's supposed to work? I mean, you're telling us in the schools that we come from nothing, we go to nothing. We evolve by random processes of natural selection and survival of the fittest. Now, if one racial group can subdue, enslave, or eliminate another racial group, well, it would seem that's the way it's supposed to work, right? Where do you get this idea about human rights? Unless you root that in God, the answer is the government gives you your rights. Well, if the government gives you your rights, the government can take your rights away, right? They can just declare your rights. And even the United Nations Declaration on Human Rights, which everybody likes to parade around, it always reminds me of, Neville Chamberlain coming back from Munich with meeting with Adolf Hitler, saying we're going to have peace in our time. This document guarantees it. And within less than a year, they were at war, right? If they don't get back to that foundation, then government is anything that it says is right. And we had a thing over here about same-sex marriage, and Christians were parading around saying, marriage is between one man and one woman. And I said, I will say, and who says? And they say, God says. I said, excuse me, but marriage is anything the state says it is. Why? Because the churches let go of marriage and deeded it over to government back in the 1930s. Once you let it go, then it's up to the state to determine what it is. And so I said, you can parade around all you want, but if half the country doesn't believe in God, they don't care. They don't care what this God of yours said. So you're right. The further we get from that, and, we have, there's a thing called, we have the Rocky Mountain chain that runs along the backbone of the country. Actually, it runs all the way from Alaska down to Tierra del Fuego in Chile. But it's the Continental Divide. And my wife's hometown was right on the Continental Divide there. And it goes up to about 3,000 meters, before it splits. And there are two streams as you cross over Berthoud Pass. There are streams on either side of the divide. And these two streams, very close to each other, when they first start out, everything looks pretty much the same. You're in the same territory. One of those streams will flow into the Atlantic. One will flow into the Pacific. So as you start, everything looks okay. Your government hasn't changed too much. Your freedoms haven't changed too much. But the further you drift apart from that watershed, the worse it gets. And finally, it just doesn't look like anything else. And so people will say, well, that'll never happen in Australia. That'll never happen in America. My first question is, what will stop it? We're on a path. We've abandoned the foundations. What will stop it? And they just stare at you. Well, I just don't think it'll happen.